Wittgenstein's Antiphilosophy is Alain Badiou's analysis of one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers. Composed of two fairly short essays, Badiou's aim is to position Wittgenstein in the tradition of antiphilosophy, borrowing the term primarily from Jacques Lacan and referencing the work of similar antiphilosophers such as Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. Badiou, in perhaps a rare move, limits his analysis to Wittgenstein's Tractatus, the first book Wittgenstein published, and the one he disregarded as completely wrong in his later work when he returned to philosophy. Badiou uses a tripartite structure to situate those involved in philosophy. There are the philosophers, who are essentially following the tradition of Plato, the pursuit of truth as a transcendent, metaphysical being. Truth is something that lies beyond sense and experience, and grounds all of our knowledge from its otherworldly position. The sophists are those who hold up a mirror to philosophy. They question philosophy and allow it to correct its course when it has gone wrong. This is the task that the later Wittgenstein takes up, correcting philosophy when it steps outside the limits of what it can say. We'll return to this momentarily. The third participant in this structure is the anti-philosopher. Like the sophist, their role is to confront the philosopher, but their confrontation is not to guide philosophy, but to awaken it. The anti-philosopher presents the philosopher with an existential crisis, a sharp reminder that for all their thinking about what lies beyond the realms of human existence, they are thinking in this moment as a product of this time. What allows the philosopher to think are always contemporary to them, and it is up to the anti-philosophers, Pascal, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and early Wittgenstein, to remind them of this. A majority of the discourse surrounding Wittgenstein centers around his later work, summed up in the Philosophical Investigations. However, in the preface to Wittgenstein's Antiphilosophy, Badiou quite quickly dismisses outright this period of Wittgenstein's thought. The reasons being that 1. The Philosophical Investigations has become too much of a foundation for 20th century philosophy, and this is something that Wittgenstein himself would have disapproved of. He argued specifically against philosophy having any absolute foundations. 2. Badiou is seemingly horrified and appalled by later Wittgenstein's dismissal of mathematics as just another language game, and refusing to privilege it. Badiou's own philosophy centers around discussion of mathematics, and he declares that once Wittgenstein goes after mathematics, he cannot rise again. This is quite a bold move on Badiou's part, to dismiss most of Wittgenstein's work in the favour of the one book he himself dismissed as fundamentally flawed and wrong. As such, this might be a divisive book, and one not everyone will find useful. The translator, in their introduction, does some work in attempting to reconcile Wittgenstein's later work with these arguments. But with this introduction taking up nearly a third of the book, it feels like it is adding more supplemental content than needed on an already difficult subject, so I would avoid straining too much over it if you are going to read it at all. The first part of the book proper deals with Wittgenstein's double-sided relationship with Nietzsche. Specifically, what did Wittgenstein see in Nietzsche's writing that revealed a part of truth? And what did Wittgenstein struggle with when Nietzsche attacks Christianity? First, what allies Wittgenstein with Nietzsche, according to Badiou, is that they both fit Lacan's definition of the anti-philosopher, which is defined by 3 points. 1. A linguistic, logical, genealogical critique of the statements of philosophy, a deposing of the categories of truth. This essentially means that the anti-philosopher's task is to turn the tools of logic, language, etc. against philosophy itself, using them to uncouple their processes from being in service to notions of truth, specifically ones that supposedly lie beyond our own existence. 2. Philosophy is not a body of doctrine, but an activity, or act. Essentially, Philosophy should affect us, create a movement in our lives, rather than be a simple following of rules of propositions to get to the truth that philosophy promises us from the outset. 3. Anti-philosophy must create a new act, avoid putting our problems into propositions, and as Badiou puts it, reaffirm the rights of the real. Kierkegaard perfectly embodied this point when he wrote, "Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced." The task of anti-philosophy, then, is to show there is an act that cannot be reduced to philosophical propositions or logic, which in turn presents philosophy itself with an existential crisis, that there is something which does not conform to its propositions, and this something is perhaps what is most important to us, which gives us meaning, which shakes philosophy to its core. Of course, the anti-philosopher cannot do this by the use of propositions themselves, otherwise it would be philosophy, but must rather show it instead. It is for this reason that Wittgenstein turns to Nietzsche, who bears his truth such that it surpasses philosophy, laying bare its limits and its supposed claim to the domain of truth. There is something that is unsayable, but to show it, we must clarify what is sayable and identify its limits. This is the project of Nietzsche and Wittgenstein's Tractatus. But Wittgenstein's alliance with Nietzsche ends the moment he attacks Christianity. To be clear, Wittgenstein, though raised as a Catholic, was not religious. He did not follow organized religion, but treated religious ideas as a kind of aesthetic, like an application for art that goes beyond any language or structured understanding. It is here that Wittgenstein perhaps turned to Kierkegaard in place of Nietzsche to deal with the existential. For Wittgenstein, philosophy ends before it can deal with the most important things: truth, the good, happiness, love, the afterlife, etc. Where Nietzsche does away with religion, he also throws out these things with it, which Wittgenstein does not agree with. He wishes to preserve the significance of existence without being able to say it, and for it to become a case of following philosophical rules. For example, we all wish to be happy, to be content in our lives, to fulfill some sort of desire or drive. But why is that? If it is just to fulfill some sort of philosophical rule, then it is pointless for Wittgenstein. And if there is no need for us to be happy, then why don't we try to be sad instead? To attempt to make our lives worse. Happiness, to continue using our example, is a sense. We can sense our own happiness. A checklist or propositional test would simply not be able to deduce this. Here, Wittgenstein is elevating sense beyond the realm of experience and propositions. This is an inverse of classic philosophy and science, where it is sense and experience that is subject to our observations and propositions, while truth is placed beyond the reach of our tools and instruments. Our happiness, our love, whether our life is good, is removed from an activity of thought and placed in the care of the act. This was a source of great conflict in Wittgenstein's own life, as he would often simply not bother acting on things if he felt that he couldn't act on it properly or fully. The Tractatus draws a circle around what philosophy can accomplish, and ultimately leading to the conclusion that philosophy is nonsense. It can only refer to itself. For example, the statement, "It is raining," does not, following the Tractatus, refer to anything about the real world. It actually says, the proposition, "It is raining," is true. It is only referring to a proposition and whether it is true within that structure, rather than whether it is actually raining or not. To know whether that proposition is true, you would have to show it as an act by perhaps looking out of the window, for example. It is only referring to a proposition and whether it is true rather than whether it is actually raining. There is no value or difference in this logic. Every true statement has the same value. If we want to know whether we are happy when it rains, we won't find our answers in propositions. It is easy to simply state, I am happy when it rains, but that can bear no resemblance to reality if we are not actually happy when it rains. Badiou identifies Wittgenstein as an anti-philosopher in the tradition of Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and so on, in that he draws a limit around what philosophy can accomplish. In short, philosophy can speak about matters of the world clearly, and the Tractatus makes clear how that may be done. The things philosophy cannot speak about, the real, happiness, the good, meaning, love, God, etc., we must, according to the final line of the Tractatus, pass over in silence. These things, which give existence their meaning, their value, are not an act of speech, but are what Badiou calls a silent ethical act. The act goes beyond all philosophy, all propositions, and all thought, and constitutes a difference that gives value to our existence. Wittgenstein inverts the typical philosophical position that truth, meaning, etc., exist beyond the realms of experience, sense, and our bodies. Things we can say, touch, etc. Instead, Wittgenstein places sense beyond what we can say, and it is made in the act that goes beyond all thought and philosophy. Philosophy itself can only speak about its own statements and nothing of the real, which essentially makes it nonsense. This is what constitutes sense and nonsense. Badiou limits his analysis to Wittgenstein to his early work embodied in the Tractatus. Wittgenstein's later work in the Philosophical Investigations is less anti-philosophy and more sophistry. It points its finger at philosophy to alert it when it is going beyond its limits. Language is not propositional, but makes sense in the context or language game in which it is used. The more that language is subject to philosophical analysis, the more that sense is removed from the language. Badiou's focus on Wittgenstein's contribution to anti-philosophy and existentialism is welcome, and a good way to follow this line of thought that is so often overshadowed by his later work. However, because his later work was so significant to the philosophy of postmodernism and 20th century philosophy as a whole, Badiou's abrupt dismissal of the majority of Wittgenstein's work should be done with an awareness of this. So if you're interested in the links between Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, etc., through the prism of existentialism or anti-philosophy, Badiou brings their work together to highlight what they share in their pursuit of anti-philosophy, namely the triumph of the real and the act itself, which philosophy cannot reach.